right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our third installment of the Mental Health in the Church series here at Santa Clara Church. If you don't know me, I think everyone in here does, but just in case you forgot, my name is Chloe Weinkoff. I get to be on staff here at Santa Clara Church. About a year ago, we started this series in May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month, and it was pretty exciting to see just how excited the staff got about this, because this is something that the church has kind of been pushing off for a while or having kind of misconstrued ideas about. And for us to take the time, take the energy, bring in people to really elevate the subject of mental health and embrace those of us who might struggle with mental health, I think is just one of the ways that we look a little bit more like Jesus. I believe it was Walt Whitman who said, be curious, not judgmental. And we have a history as humans and as Christians of being judgmental and making judgments when we should be asking questions. And there's one person in my life who's really, really good at asking questions, and I would say he's one of the most empathetic people that I know, one of the best listeners, and he happens to also be my brother-in-law. So tonight we're going to hear from him, Pastor Andrew Loyd. He got his Bachelor's of Arts in Worship from Bushnell University a few years ago, and then followed up with his master's in theology and ministry from Fuller Seminary. It sounds better. I'll write to Congress about that. We'll get some stuff moving and shaking. But Andrew is going to come up and he is going to talk to us about OCD and unseen suffering and the power of compassion. If you came in, you would have noticed that there's papers on the back table that have some resources as well as some notes. Feel free to take notes throughout as he's speaking tonight. Write down questions. There's going to be a time afterwards for you to ask him questions. And Andrew is actually an omnipotent being. He knows everything. So ask him all the questions. He has all the answers. We're having catering come in. We'll be here all night. It'll be great. So will you join me in welcoming Pastor Andrew Loyd to the stage tonight?
Thank you. I was actually just telling someone today, like she said, I'm a pastor, so I did the Sunday thing this morning. I was actually telling one of my good friends this morning that I could write a book about what I don't know. And we'd actually sell them as journals, because it would be like chapter 1 blank, chapter 2 blank, which is not a good way to start a speech. But I'm so glad to be here with you today. I think it is so cool what Santa Clara is doing, bridging this gap between church and mental health. There's probably a variety of reasons that gap exists, but if God made us with brains and bodies and souls, and they're all interconnected, stewarding them well is a really important thing that we get to do. So today, I get to talk to you about my mental health journey a little bit, about what has kind of encapsulated a lot of that, and really an invitation for all of us to create space for suffering, which is, another fave topic, and to embrace more compassion in our lives, because it's a really powerful thing. For myself, my journey with mental health really began when I was about 8 years old. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, that is where my journey began. And so come back with me. Come back with me about 20-ish years. We're just getting out of the 90s. We survived Y2K, much to everyone's disbelief. The planes didn't crash, nothing blew up. We got through the 2000s, and I was an 8-year-old kid. And if I do say so myself, I was a courageous 8-year-old kid. My favorite thing to do as an 8-year-old boy was to hang out at my grandparents' property. They had a couple of 100 acres out in the country, and there was no shortage of stupid things an 8-year-old kid could do out in the country at 8 years old. I rode bikes. I built the sketchiest of bike ramps out of firewood. I would climb trees, fall down, and miraculously not have broken bones. I would pick up snakes, not caring whether or not I got bit by them or whether I should check to make sure that they were poisonous or not. All kinds of fun, wild things. I was courageous. Exactly. There's a thin line between courage and stupidity, and that line was even thinner with me at 8 years old. And everything changed for me September of the year that I was 8 years old. During September, there was some interesting things that happened globally and in my life. When I was 8 years old, it was 2001, and in September, we all dealt with the national tragedy and trauma of two planes flying into the Twin Towers. And I remember being an 8-year-old kid, and I remember the morning that it happened, waking up, going to the couch to eat my bowl of Fruity Pebbles. I remember it very distinctly. I can smell the aroma. And I remember the TV being on, and I saw smoke, and there was concern with my parents. And then I went to school, and there was concern with everybody. And I, as an 8-year-old kid who had not really had any experiences with death or suffering, didn't really know how to make sense of that trauma that I was seeing on the TV screen on replay. So that's kind of trauma one as an 8-year-old kid, not knowing what to do with this suffering thing and this death thing. And then just a couple of weeks later, I experienced a trauma that was much closer to my home and to my heart. That wonderful place in the country that I would visit and be stupid and courageous at was my grandparents' house. And I was so close with my grandparents. I loved my grandparents. Summer times were filled with my grandparents. My grandpa would have multiple chairs scattered throughout the countryside so he could just walk and sit with me wherever I went, whether I was playing by the tire swing or over here or over here. And 2 weeks after this national tragedy, I lost my grandfather. He passed away, and he was one of the closest people to me in my life. And so I, as an 8-year-old kid, my brain ain't done cooking for another, 20 years or so. I'm growing, I'm learning. I have this onslaught of suffering and death that I don't know how to make sense of. And when that happened, I don't really have a way to describe it better than it felt like my brain broke. As I entered 4th grade into the next year, I had so much fear and so much anxiety. I had this obsession with death. Now that death was so close to me, I was worried that it would happen to me. And so I was terrified of the idea that I would be contaminated or there were germs that I could not see. I was terrified that there was kind of some unseen, scary reality that would take place and that I needed to be hyper aware and hyper vigilant to avoid it. I remember in 4th grade is when I had my first panic attack, which panic attacks kind of induce a more severe panic attack. It's a very, very silly thing. But as I entered my late grade school, middle school years, I just remember terror and uncertainty being my reality. I didn't have language for it. I didn't know how to make sense of it. All I knew is that I was suffering silently in my little 4th grade body. And it hasn't really been until these last few years that I've been able to actually put language to that experience in my life. I didn't know it at the time, but this trauma that I experienced in 3rd grade really ushered in and created this development of obsessive-compulsive disorder in my life. Didn't know what it was, didn't have language for it, but now looking back, I can see that that's what happened with my brain. As the trauma hit me, that's how my brain responded. And for many years, I suffered silently because of it. And so today, as we are bridging the gap between spirituality, mental health, our bodies, all those wonderful, wonderful things, I want to talk to you a little bit about what it is, what OCD is, and give some language around something that had me suffering for a long, long time. Because chances are, there's probably someone in your life who does have this, and they might be in a spot right now where they don't have language around it and don't know how to get the help for it. And so being informed is one of the ways we take the step to being more compassionate. And so as we start today, we're going to start with definitions, because I hate following along with the talk and we never defined anything. It has me stressed the whole time. I'm a note taker. I'm a nerd. It stresses me out when we don't define stuff. So as we begin today and enter the story, I want to talk about what OCD is, because it's a very misrepresented and misunderstood area of mental health. So in this next slide here, we have an O, we have a C, and we have a D. And OCD stands for 3 specific things: obsessions, compulsions, and disorder. And so we're going to kind of break that all down. So for a brain that has obsessive compulsive disorder, that is considered a neurodivergent brain. If any of you heard that term before. Yep, our neurodivergent people in the back. So neurodivergent just means your brain is not what the typical is. So like a neurotypical brain approaches life a certain way. A neurodivergent brain approaches it a very different way. So that's one thing that we got to understand. It's just your brain approaching life, information, the things that we're doing in a very different way. And for a neurodivergent brain that has OCD, it can't deal with intrusive thoughts the way that normal human brains can. I don't want to say normal, typical human brains can. So it starts with this thing called an obsession. That's what the O stands for. And an obsession is a intrusive thought that causes distress or anxiety. So whether you know it or not, we all have intrusive thoughts. You're driving down the road, you're living your best life, and a crazy thought enters in your mind. You know, maybe it's like, I should just fly to Mexico. Don't know where that came from. I'm gonna move along with my day. Maybe you're driving and you see a bicyclist in the other lane, and this thought kind of just comes in that just kind of goes, what if I just, whoa, that was weird. Where did that come from, right? We have weird thoughts that just pop in our brain. Our brains take on so much information in a day that is a very normal, typical thing. The thing that's different about a brain that has OCD is that where a normal brain might be able to say, that was a weird thought, throw it in the trash can and move on with my day, a brain that has OCD can't do that because the brain is wired differently. And so they get this intrusive thought in their head that causes significant distress. And I'm not just talking about like a low burn anxiety, like when you have to have an awkward conversation with somebody, like distress. The word that I often associate with that feeling is terror. And so it can happen a lot of different ways. If you're super interested, you could look up common obsessions with OCD. For me in my life, it was typically contamination. I was worried that I would touch something, that there was like a germ somewhere, and it was on me, and it would like harm me or kill me. And so normally, for a normal brain, you're like, okay, I'll wash my hands, I'm good with my life. You look at your kids, you see them like grab fists full of dirt and eat it, and you're like, they'll be fine. For someone with OCD, when an obsession comes in and latches onto your brain is just wired different, and you can't get rid of it. And it causes significant anxiety, distress, terror. Another way this kind of tends to happen is catastrophizing. You might get this idea like, man, something bad is going to happen. And if I don't do X, Y, Z, that bad thing is going to happen. And that's kind of what leads us to the compulsion side of things. There's the obsession, the thought that pops in your brain, and then there is the compulsion, which is the action you do to relieve distress. So a lot of times this looks different ways. For me, if I was worried there was like a germ or something on me, I'd need to wash my hands. And I would like wash my hands and wash my hands and wash my hands. I also had a thing where for me growing up, sometimes I'd get a thought like, man, something bad is going to happen. I need to make sure I turn the TV up in increments of even numbers for it not, for the world not to fall apart. I need to make sure that while I'm reading my book, I need to get to a certain page or else this giant catastrophe is going to happen. Like these are thoughts that would enter my brain, and I would feel like I needed to do those things to keep them from happening. Does that sound weird? Does that sound kind of strange, kind of confusing? That's okay if it does. Yeah, I see. My wife shook her head. It's fine. You can shake your head. That sounds weird, right? It sounds kind of like, man, do we put you away in the nut house? Like, what do we do with this, right? But here's the deal. That kind of gets us to the disorder side of things. You have the obsession, which is the intrusive thought. You have the compulsion, which is the action you do to relieve the stress and anxiety. And a lot of times, the action is not related to the obsession at all. So, for instance, if you feel like you're germy, you might wash your hands. If you feel like something bad is going to happen, like some global catastrophe that you can't do anything about, you turning to a certain book and a page isn't going to save the day. They're not always related. But the D in OCD stands for disorder, and that's a really important word. Disorder is different than psychosis. Those are two different things. The word disorder is a word that medically means a disturbance of normal functioning, which means the OCD brain just functions different than the regular brain. The brain knows that there isn't just some looming catastrophe that depends on you turning up the TV in even numbers to save the day. But the brain can't tell the difference between what you actually rationally know is the deal. It's not that someone who has OCD is out of touch with reality. Their brain is just wired in a way that is causing a lot of distress and anxiety. A psychosis, that means we're a little out of touch with reality and we maybe need some super intense treatment. Disorder means the brain is wired a different way. For me, it felt like my brain was broken. But that's what those three words stand for. The obsession, which is an intrusive thought, the compulsion, which is the action, and the disorder, which means our brain's all screwy. We don't need to visit the nut house. Our brains are just a little screwy. And so, like it was for me, the onset of this happened with a bunch of severe traumas kind of hitting my life all at the same time. And while there's still a lot that people are learning about the brain, there are some kind of overarching ideas, some overarching contributors that the medical world has attributed to what causes this in a person's brain. And so they've really kind of narrowed it down, very broadly still, to genetics, your brain structure, and your environment, which could also mean trauma. That they've noticed that when it comes to genetics, if someone in your family has obsessive compulsive disorder, it's a much higher likelihood that you will have it as well. That there is some kind of a genetic component to this being passed down and passed around. There's not expansive studies on this, but the ones they have done is they've seen similarities in family members having this mental health thing. The other thing that they have noticed is that your brain structure and functioning also play a role. Like the way an OCD brain functions is completely different than how a normal brain functions. There's this really cool picture we have on the screen here. It's pretty wild. So if you look at the screen there, the top row is a brain that's being analyzed, and that's a neurotypical brain, a brain that functions kind of up to standards, right? And on the bottom is a brain scan of someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder. All those fun little lights mean that's what part of your brain is lit up. Do you notice how much more color is on the bottom OCD brain as opposed to the top neurotypical brain? That medically, the brains literally function different. That OCD brains tend to be hypervigilant, hyper alert, always aware of danger, because that's this thing that continually rolls on and on and on in their mind. So genetics are a contributor, and the way the brain actually functions and the way the brain is wired is a contributor, because it's literally wired different, and so is environment. That was my story. My story was this mental health thing hit me when I experienced severe change in my environment and pretty significant trauma. So that's, in a nutshell, what OCD is and a little bit of what contributes to it. How we doing? Good? All right. I think one of the things that leads to a lot of the silent suffering I talked about is that it's kind of a hard concept to wrap your head around, like especially if you don't struggle with this, it's kind of hard to think of. I don't really understand it, the idea that you hold on to a thought and you can't let the thought go and you feel like you have to respond with an action. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that's okay. Like if that's not your jam of what you struggle with, that is all right. But it is important that we have a good understanding of it, because most people who struggle with this don't have language around it, because it's just weird to tell someone you love, hey, sometimes I worry that the world's coming to an end in my brain and I feel like I gotta touch the light switch so many times to keep it from happening. That's a hard conversation to have, but that is how the brain works. And a lot of times people who have OCD, it takes them up to 14 to 17 years to receive treatment for it. 14 to 17 years. That's 14 to 17 years of not feeling safe in your own mind. That's 14 to 17 years of not having language to talk to someone else about how scared you are of the way your brain works. That's 14 to 17 years of anxiety, oftentimes depression is tied in, distress, and just being worn out. And a big thing that contributes to this is there being a lot of information about what OCD is. Because how many of you have maybe said or heard, I'm so OCD, I just love all my pens to be in a row. I just need to color code things. I just need everything to be just so. Typically when we associate things like an actual brain thing with organization, it keeps us from really knowing what's going on in our heart and in our minds. So I have a couple things on here, which are some misconceptions when it comes to this particular mental health disorder. And there are a lot of them, and I just want to go through a few of them today. One of the misconceptions, like I said, is that having OCD means that you love organizing, detail, and order. And there are some people who struggle with OCD who are the most disorganized cats that you've ever met in your whole stinking life. Typically, associating OCD with this kind of thing kind of trivializes it and makes it seem like it's a cute personality quirk. There is a particular celebrity whose name is Chloe. It's not this Chloe, although she's very, very popular around this wonderful church, who is very perfectionistic and really kind of plays this up and has led to a lot of misinformation because perfectionism or organizing or things like that has been what they've associated with it. The reality is that this is actually another your obsession with like control and perfectionism and things like that is typically associated with another thing called OCPD, which is more of a personality thing as opposed to like an actual brain disorder. OCPD is I need control, I need to be perfect all the time, and the OCD thing is my brain is literally broke and I'm having a hard time keeping up with what it's feeding me. One of the other misconceptions is that we're all just a little bit OCD. Which, if you remember Chloe's talk from last year, if you have a brain that's wired different, that usually isn't the case. If your brain is wired and you have a neurodivergent brain, that doesn't mean that we all have neurodivergent brains, to have a widespread, we're all a little this, we're all a little that, we're all a little that, typically is really harmful and keeps people from actually achieving diagnoses they need in order to move forward with their lives. Another misconception is that a person's obsessions make them violent and or crazy. Sometimes the intrusive thoughts people get are like really scary ones. Mine were intense, but they were typically kind of very general, like, oh my gosh, something bad will happen. Some people live in like severe terror because the intrusive thoughts they get are pretty violent in nature. And that's really intense. But with OCD, a lot of the obsessive thoughts you get are ego-dystonic, which means they're actually against your value and belief system, which is why they cause so much stress. The reality is that a lot of times mental health conditions make you more prone to being a victim of violence rather than a perpetrator of violence. That one of the highest contributors to being a violent person usually is you've had violence done to you. That there's this big stigma on mental health, which we're untangling in these awesome nights, which is that people with mental health things you're kind of crazy, you're more prone to violence or things like that. But really, the research says you're more likely to be a victim rather than a perpetrator of violence. The final misconception that I want to touch on is the idea that OCD is not an adjective. It's a literal brain wiring. It's not a cute quirk. It's not I'm just so like this because I'm organized. It is a mental health disorder. And it's really important that we just have as much of an understanding as we can so we can show more empathy and point people in the right direction. So what do you do? What do you do when a loved one comes up to you and they say, hey, I get these weird thoughts, they really stress me out, I have to tap this thing, I have to wash my hands, I have to count up to a certain number, and I just don't know what to do. What do I do? What are the steps? Well, in the world, as we get more mental health people who are trained, know more about the world, there's a few things that have proven to be really helpful if that is something that you struggle with. And like most mental health things, it's on a spectrum. So some people experience things really subtly. Some people experience things really intensely. And a lot of the treatment that has been around being obsessive compulsive has been this really, I don't want to say groundbreaking, but this really helpful form of therapy called exposure and response prevention. That to get connected to a therapist who's trained in helping people with this specific mental health disorder and have them work you through ERP, which is exposure response prevention. And basically, this means the thing that freaks you out and causes all the distress, we're going to put some of that in front of you so that you learn that it's not actually associated with danger and death. So for example, if my thing is contamination, I'm worried about germs, and I'm so stressed about germs that I wash my hands excessively. Like not just because colds, not just because COVID, but just like excessively to where it doesn't make any sense. Part of the therapeutic approach, or the thing that could be helpful in overcoming that, might be touching a candy bar to the floor and then taking a bite of the candy bar. That's just specifically working with the obsession that you have and providing exposure to it so that you're training your mind and your body to say, this thing will not kill me. Even if my brain says it, even if I feel like I need to wash my hands a million times and not eat something that was on the floor, that's what I need to do. So if that's something that someone in your life who maybe has this needs to go through, they need to go through it with a therapist. That's a good way to do it so that you just don't jump off of the deep end. But that's proven to be really helpful in about 70 to 80% of people who have gone through that, who have OCD. The other thing that a lot of people experience is medication. I have a cousin who has OCD, and for her, getting onto the right kind of medication with the help of her therapist and her medical professional was what she needed. And a lot of times with a lot of mental health things that happen, there's multiple things going on: anxiety, depression, PTSD. A lot of times these things all go together, and so it's really helpful to have multiple people helping you figure out what's best for you. The other thing that tends to be really helpful with treatment is mindfulness. Is that a word that scares anybody? Okay, we got a very good, this is our second series of mental health series. We're getting places. We're not scared of these things. So mindfulness is just being aware of what's going on in your brain, in your body, not really just stressing out about it, but just letting it be. Really, this is actually something that comes out of years of tradition in the church, and really it's just a generalized way of thinking about contemplative prayer. It's a way of just sitting and just being, and as thoughts kind of pop up, oh, I didn't do the laundry. We're just going to let it float by, you know? I think the kids are killing each other back there. We'll just let it float on by. It'll be fine. You know, I think I smell the roast burning. We'll just let it go. No, don't let the roast burn. Don't let the kids kill each other. But you get what I'm getting at, right? That this idea of mindfulness is being aware of your brain, aware of your body, and not latching on to things, but just letting it go. For someone who literally has a brain thing that makes thoughts just stick, learning to accept them as they are and practice self-compassion and limited judgment is really an important way to recovering. And a lot of times these things all go together. Having a good therapist, learning about being mindful or having contemplative prayer with Jesus, or maybe getting on some medication. A lot of times these things work together to make it all happen. So as we kind of get more towards the end of our thing today, I just want to give you a couple stats about how prevalent this particular mental health disorder is. And I really want the rubber to meet the road about what we can do when we experience loved ones who have that. But even more importantly than that, how do we deal with the idea of hidden suffering? Because really, this is a mental health disorder where a lot of people suffer silently. The reality is it's not just limited to this. So to give you a couple of stats just for your information, the World Health Organization estimates that about 1.6% of the world population has obsessive compulsive disorder. To make it a little more national, the National Institute of Mental Health estimates that it could be anywhere between 1.2 to 2.3 of the U.S. population that has it. Of that U.S. population, a little bit over 50% say that their mental health disorder with OCD is serious. Close to 35% say that it is moderate, and about 14.6% say that it is mild. In my life, what that has meant is if it's mild and it's a little bit more chill, I might get some thoughts in there, but I can deal with it. I can breathe through it. I could just kind of let it go. I can move on with my day. Back in 2018, I was going through some really intense things in my life. Didn't have a lot of margin in my life. Wasn't taking care of my body well. And I was so terrified of things triggering my OCD that it would cause me significant stress about going out. It was really scary for me to go to a restaurant that had a TV, because what if something popped up on there, I got an intrusive thought, and I would just be stress city. And that causes significant distress to the brain and to the body. It's something that's significant enough that the world and the nation are taking note, making adjustments as necessary. And I don't know if it's one of those things where when you buy a Toyota, you notice all the Toyotas. You have that thing happen, like you get a Camry and you're like, man, there's so many Camrys around here, I never knew. I don't know if that's the case with me, where I'm more aware of it because I have it and I have language around it now. But I'm having more conversations with people, and as I have a conversation with them, they'll be like, oh my gosh, I have that. I know someone who has that. I actually, just this last week, have a person that I do some coaching with, and he and his wife have been taking this walk through her having a lot of anxiety. And recently they found out that was it just anxiety, but it was actually OCD. And the way he was trying to help relieve her anxiety was just making it worse. And actually having the language around that was extremely helpful for them to get the help that they needed. Which begs the question, what do you do when your loved one has something like this that they're dealing with? Well, a couple of the things that just generally we can do to be helpful with loved ones and those around us is just have some information around it. This is just a big old 35,000-foot view, but just to have an understanding of, okay, what is it? It's not this you're a crazy person thing. It's just that your brain is wired different. That's an important first step so that you can help people get pointed in the right direction. Great resource for that is the International OCD Foundation. Another thing you can do is encourage and support treatment. That's just a really simple thing to do. There's still a lot of stigmas around mental health, and to be someone who listens well to people who are going through things, to be someone who helps them find out how to get connected to maybe like a therapist or a group to help them out is really, really huge. You could also learn how to recognize and reduce accommodating behavior. If that's something you're interested in, that you have someone close to you right now who has that, there's some resources in the back, and we can talk about where to go through with that. If you don't, that's not necessarily on the top of the list. But all these things are wrapped up in what I call the tortilla of compassion. Have you ever made a great burrito or had a great burrito? You have the perfect sauce and the perfect chicken and the lettuce and the sour cream. It's all so good. It's nothing. I mean, I'm sorry for your burrito bowl, people, but it's nothing if you don't have it wrapped in the tortilla, right? If we really want to make a difference in people's lives with this, but with mental health in general, we gotta have everything wrapped in the tortilla of compassion. If you don't remember another thing tonight, wrap it all up in the tortilla of compassion. That's what matters. One of the things that has been most significant to me in my life, in this invitation to be more compassionate with people, love people, help them through their emotional, spiritual, mental stuff, is to look at Jesus when he sits at a table and Jesus when he sits in a garden. One of the beautiful things that you do here at Santa Clara is you share the Lord's table every week. You drink the cup, you take the bread. And when Jesus sat at a table, when we remember that, when Jesus sits at this table, he says this interesting thing, particularly in the Gospel of Luke. Dr. Luke writes that Jesus sits down at this table with his closest friends, and he says, when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. Jesus is sitting at a table with his friends. It's mere hours before he is going to suffer and die for the sins of humanity. And what does he do? What does he want? What does he desire? To be with his friends. He's not asking them to take the suffering away from them. They don't even have the authority to do that. As he's getting ready to suffer and take on their sins, your sin, and my sin, he just wants their presence. He wants the presence of his friends who he loves. Unfortunately, they blow it a little bit. He just kind of wants to have a good meal with them. There's a bunch of drama. Judas sneaks out. They start arguing about who's the coolest one. And they blow it a little bit. And that's a big fear we have. I want to be compassionate. I want to be with you. I want to feel your suffering. I want to feel your pain and be in here with you. But I'm scared I'm going to do it wrong. What if I make it all about me? What if I do this? What if I just do it wrong? The word compassion means to suffer with. And we have a lot of fear suffering with other people because we're scared we're going to do it wrong. And the disciples don't just blow it at the table, they blow it in the garden. Jesus is like, okay, dinner kind of got away from us. Can you come with me to the garden, and I'm going to pray, and I want you to come and pray with me. There's few things more intimately you can do than pray with and for someone. And Jesus goes out and he prays and he is suffering. It says in Luke's gospel that sweat is like drops of blood. When you look at Luke's account, Jesus, by every definition and account, has a panic attack in the garden before he goes to suffer on the cross. And every time he goes back to his disciples, they saw on logs. They're snoring away. The only person to comfort Jesus in the garden, according to Luke's account, is an angel who comes down to love on him a little bit. We're worried that we're going to blow it like the disciples. We're going to want to be compassionate. We're going to want to suffer along with people, but we're going to do it wrong. And the fear of doing it wrong keeps us from actually being compassionate with people and listening to their pain and not having a solution, but just saying, I'll sit here with you. But the reality is that even if you do it wrong, I think we should do it. We can learn. And the beautiful thing about Jesus in the garden is that it points us to what happens a few hours later on the cross. That it's not about your inability to do things that defines you, but about Jesus' ability to do great things that defines you. And if we're trusting in him, there's lots of room to mess up as we try this compassion thing. It's very important that we do this compassion thing, especially when it comes to mental health, especially it comes to our minds and our bodies and our souls. And the cool thing about Jesus is that as he suffers alone in a garden, he actually is redeeming something in that, where if you experience suffering, you don't have to do it alone, because the very Spirit of God that raised him from the grave resides in you. And the invitation of God is to experience his Spirit. And like it says in Colossians, clothe yourselves in compassion for the people around you. So as we finish up today, there's just a couple of takeaways that I want to leave with you. And first and foremost, I want it to be Jesus. The reality that Jesus suffers alone in a garden so that you never have to suffer alone. And that Jesus births out of his resurrection, the church is birthed. And the church is a beautiful, wonderful place where we can continue that compassionate community so people don't suffer alone. I'd also invite you to be as properly informed as you can about as many mental health things as you can. It's just something that continues to grow. And the churches that want to care for people holistically are the churches that are doing wonderful work of God. So be informed as you can. Normalize this kind of stuff so people have an opportunity to get the treatment they need. And above all else, practice compassion, because it is one of the most powerful tools at your disposal. There's a lot I can't do. I started by telling you that. I could write a book about what I don't know, but I could sit with you. I can love you as best as I can, and I can open my heart enough to suffer with you. And that's the invitation I would have for you today as we follow our suffering Savior. I don't know how to end things without praying, so I'll just hand it over to Chloe at this point.
Thank you so much. Andrew, is that it? Andrew? Yeah. Right, okay. He's my brother-in-law, if that wasn't obvious. Thank you so much for sharing. As mentioned before, Andrew is a pastor down in Cottage Grove at Riverside Church of God. Is that what it's called?
Riverside's fine.
Riverside's fine. If you don't know where it is, it's by the side of a river. And again, as I said, Andrew is just one of the most compassionate people that I know, and when he talks about joining you in your suffering, he is being so accurate with that. I think he's one of the best examples that I know of Jesus getting down in the dirt with somebody to experience what they're experiencing. And would you tell us what the mission statement of your church is?
To connect hurting people with the hope and healing of Jesus.
How powerful is that? Oh my goodness. So if you want to learn more about Andrew's church and the ministry that they're doing, check out their website, join in prayer with them. They're doing some pretty incredible stuff down there. Now is the time I'm going to open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions that they came up throughout, I have about 100, but I know where he lives and I can call him at any time. So this would be the time for any of you guys to ask any questions for him to answer. And I can run around. All right.
Might not have the answers, but we can work through it together.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is regarding, so for you, you've experienced this for a long while and come to realizations along the path. Did you find that that growing up, that church people, I just say this sort of broadly, that Christians sometimes respond to this sort of anxiety and things? Did you find that you encountered people who sort of threw prayer at it or threw Bible verses at it? And not to like downplay it, but how did that kind of response work for you? And what did you find, like, how do you deal with that when you encounter it, I guess is maybe the best way to put it.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very good question. So for me growing up, I grew up in a good old Pentecostal church. If I told you about it, it might scare you a little bit, and I don't want to do that. But for me, I'll back up and say this. Something that can be tied with OCD is religious rumination. So the thoughts that scare you could be very religious in nature with that. My church was a little turn or burny growing up, so that was not terribly helpful. I did have people in my life who were very great, and so typically I would worry and worry and worry, and then I would like, blah, I'm scared I'm gonna die, and then they would kind of console me and comfort me, which was, really, really great. The downside is, since we didn't really know what was wrong with my brain, I think that actually reinforced some stuff rather than not. And that's not to anyone's fault about anything. Like, this is just things that people have recently done. I think by and large, with most mental health things, I experience a lot of what I call Bible Band-Aids with it. And sometimes we're really good at using the Bible to keep us from actually engaging with the Bible. And so what I've experienced a lot of times is that when you present, I'm going through suffering, I have this brain thing that I don't know how to talk about, I got the depressies. If you're experiencing that, even now, like both as a kid growing up and now as a pastor, I see Bible Band-Aids all the time. It'll just get better. Resurrection's coming, Sunday's coming. I get that a lot. And really, it seems to me, and I've experienced it in my own life, it's like a fear of sitting in the pain of Friday and just skipping to Sunday. But you don't get the whole gospel without the suffering of Friday, which is resurrected in Sunday. And so the Bible's awesome. Like, don't be scared to give people scriptures. I've been in situations where that's been really, really helpful and healing. But just be very aware of why you're using scripture. And if scripture feels like a Band-Aid that keeps you from engaging in the pain of your story, chances are we might not be using it right. That's what I've experienced in my own life. So I don't know if that kind of helps.
Yeah, that was a question. I mean, those things always, because I know a lot of times I bring that one up because I've done that, like been uncomfortable in the moment and thrown, prayer or scripture at something, and so it's a growing spot for me too. The other question I had, you kind of touched a little bit on sort of popular culture's portrayal of OCD, whether it's people in reality TV or whatnot. But there's every now and again there's a movie or something. I mean, unfortunately, too many crime shows do things with any sort of mental health disorder or neurodivergence. They'll just throw it on screen, and they're inevitably the serial killer, which is not helpful. But have there been, popular culture things that have been helpful? Like, I think of movies, and ones I think of are older because I'm older, but like As Good as It Gets sort of pushes towards this concept, and Jack Nicholson is our favorite neurodivergent person, I feel like. So have you found that there are movies that have actually pushed this in a good way, or popular culture that has actually been valuable in the conversation around OCD, and what kinds of things are you seeing out there that give you hope for, like, oh, the world isn't just sort of like using the word OCD as like a we just throw this whenever somebody's a little bit
Yeah.
challenged?
Yeah, that's a great question. And fun fact about me, I'm such a movie nerd. Like, I will quote movies to you as much as you will let me. That's a very good question. I'm not as aware of movies that do a good portrayal. I will say, and that's just my own limitedness that I haven't really experienced it. What I will say is one thing that has been really powerful and really cool is that these last couple years in particular, I don't know if something with kind of the stress and intensity and trauma of COVID made more people come to light, but there's been some famous people who legitimately do suffer with it, who have really used their voice to normalize it more. A very famous one is Howie Mandel. He's majorly got it, and he has really partnered with a lot of people to describe what it is not, worked with other organizations. Another guy is Luke Combs, the country singer. He was on a really great podcast. Don't know what podcast it was. I just saw a clip. But he spent maybe 3 to 5 minutes just talking about what it was and what it was like for him to experience it. And, country people are only supposed to write about heartbreaks and sunshine and, brand awareness and different things. Sorry if you're a big country fan. But anyways, I've been noticing that stuff coming up more, which has been really, really helpful for me. If anybody does have any movie suggestions, please let me know.
What About Bob?
Yes. Why didn't I think about What About Bob? I love What About Bob. Bob is a great example. So, Becca, thank you. Do we have a fair amount that have seen What About Bob? Okay, I love What About Bob. What About Bob's great. And actually, this is really silly because my parents are here, but I really struggled with this during middle school. And I don't know when they introduced me to What About Bob, but they legitimately said, hey, we got this movie, and it really seems like this guy kind of deals with some of the stuff you do. And he kind of goes on a journey to be less afraid of death. And we watched What About Bob, and it kind of changed my life because of that. As silly as that is, I've never personally had OCD therapy. What About Bob was very helpful.
Yes.
Thank you for mentioning that because that escaped me. So,
Okay, I actually
What
have
About
a
Bob?
question.
No, that's good. Sorry.
Okay, so you talked about your story about when you were 8 years old, 9/11, your grandpa passing, and I actually know a lot of people whose triggers start early in life like that. But it's really easy because you assume children are really adaptable to know what to do when a child is experiencing trauma and they're silent about it because they don't know how to process it. So do you have any suggestions on how to meet with a young person early on so that it doesn't become as big a struggle? It might still be a struggle, but as big a struggle later in life.
Oh, that's a really, really great question. Yeah, I'll just kind of speak from my experience a little bit. Because especially with kids, it's hard because your brain doesn't really stop cooking until your mid-20s. Like your brain is still forming and developing and becoming a brain till like your mid-20s. And so it can be kind of hard with kids sometimes of like, man, what is a trauma thing? What is just this kid growing up and going through, not having a nightlight anymore or something like that. I think for parents in particularly, the number one thing you can do, and this is just the biggest thing you can do with your kids anyway, is be a very attuned parent. Like just very tuned into where your kid is at. Like just, and I'm not talking about, you have to set cameras up in their room or anything, but like just learning how to be with your kid and like know them and see them, and we're a little off. What's going on? Creating space for them to describe their emotions as best as they can, and like not really tell them what to think or feel, but give them more language around it. I think that's something that I've seen some parents really model that well, and I've been really impressed in the ways that just provides spots for their kids. I would say as well that especially now it's much more of a normalized thing for younger kids to see therapists. And especially if you have wonderings or questions about that, I think that's a great partnership to have. It might be they have a couple sessions and the therapist is like, I think they seem like just like a fine growing person, but they can kind of point you around, and if it is kind of a specialized thing, getting them connected to someone who specializes in those kinds of things. Like, I think that's a really helpful thing. And I do think that anxiety is just very infectious. And so I think a lot of kids are really experiencing more traumatic things earlier just because anxiety is infectious and, all these different things. But yeah, I would say attunement and not being scared of bringing in like a professional if you feel like, man, we just would like to know, if nothing for the sake of knowing. So that's what comes to my mind when you mention that.
I have it. And so I just want to encourage you young people, you're babies to me, all of you, and that throughout your whole life, keep walking as closely with the Lord as you can possibly walk. Because all of the questions and all the Band-Aids and all that comes with life. And we have to be examples to the next generation. So our responsibility is great. And you will go through loss, and you will go through pain, and you will go through suffering. There's no denying that for each and every one of us. But get as close to Jesus as you can possibly get, and never let go of his hand. And you will grow in ways that he can use you with all kinds of people. Thanks.
I don't know if I'm allowed to have a favorite. I think you're my favorite. Oh my gosh, that's so good. And that's been so much of my journey these last 3 years. I have had a lot of suffering in my life the last 3 years. If you want to hang out and talk about it, we could talk about it. But my relationship with Jesus would not be what it is today had I not suffered. And some of the things that have made the biggest impact on my life and grown me closer to Jesus has been my suffering, and it's been seeing people I love go through suffering. Because more than anything, the thing that preaches the best is your real life with Jesus. You can't fake that, you just can't fake it. And to see how someone a little bit ahead of you goes through suffering with Jesus, that's going to preach louder than anything else. So thank you for sharing that. Oh, that was wonderful.
Can I ask a question before I pass the mic over this way?
We might not want to get him the mic anyway. I'm just kidding. I mean, I know how.
So, what would you say to someone that thinks they have OCD and some other things, and what would really help them is seeing a therapist, but some of their OCD, specifically their obsession and intrusive thoughts, is a fear of therapists, and would rather sit in silent suffering than go talk to a therapist, because if you truly opened up to a therapist, they could put you in a hold or whatever, and you just don't want to do it. What would you say?
That's extremely hypothetical. So that's a very good question, because I hate scheduling appointments. If I can't schedule it online, I have left barbers because I could not schedule the appointment online, just because I don't want to do the phone call because it stresses me out. And like, doctors are scary, and the whole mental health thing is like a whole different kind of doctor. Like, yikes, right? So there's a couple things I think I would say. First, I would start working with people you trust. I would start working with people you trust, because they could hopefully take some of that fear out by saying, I can refer you to someone amazing because I've been to them. That's very, very helpful. If you do think it's specifically obsessive compulsive disorder, which there's a lot of stigma around, is really hard to describe to someone who doesn't know it, and you're like, I don't know what to do with this, I would recommend seeing someone who specializes in that first. And if you don't got it, we'll move you on to a regular counselor. If you do got it, they already have the language, they know you're not crazy, they like I said, disorder, not a psychosis, and so they kind of can alleviate some of that anxiety. The little write-up I have in the back has this great resource of a place that you can go to find OCD therapists specifically. But it is scary. It is absolutely scary. And I think really talking to people who are close to you, who love you, who could maybe make suggestions, and even just encourage you in it is so, so huge. I think that's so, so huge. But your brain is worth it. Your brain is worth it. And so get the encouragement you need. Get people around you, hypothetically speaking. I would say really lean into people who can encourage you. Mr. Walker.
Yeah. Hey, so Andrew, I was wondering, you've explained 8 years old, the towers and all those things, and obviously sorry about your grandpa, but what what steps did you personally take? Because I'm thinking you're probably on the other side or close to the other side today of all that. So what was maybe the first a couple big steps for you?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say it's more on the mild side for me today, for sure. I would say the first thing that was really helpful for me was learning self-compassion. For me, I really realized that when I was in higher forms of stress and taking care of my mind and my body less, it would flare up worse. And so a huge step was learning how to take care of myself better, like put limits on myself, be able to just say, I can't do this today. My brain has too much going on. Self-compassion was a really big one. I think getting informed was another important step. I don't remember how it started. I think I was going through Instagram or something and someone talked about intrusive thoughts and I was like, oh my gosh, I have that. And then I was like, deep in the hole and they were like, these are compulsions. I was like, oh my gosh, I have that. And so it was finally kind of like gave some language. And so having some language around it helped, because that's a big thing with trauma. When you experience trauma, the two big things is you're powerless and you're voiceless. And since my brain stuff was always associated with my trauma, having other people lend their voice on it was really helpful. So just kind of getting some language around it from, maybe I have a couple books that I recommend or something like that is really helpful. So that was helpful, self-compassion. And also having the courage to step into scary things. Because like for me, like I said, 2018 was when it flared up really bad for me. And I was scared of going to restaurants with TVs because I was scared that something would come up that would be an intrusive thought and I'd be like in the hole for the next few days. And so learning how to just kind of take a step of like, this is extremely uncomfortable and feels very terrifying, but like being able to take that step and be like, wow, I did that and lived. Like for me, that's a really important part of it. I did that and lived, needing to prove that to myself. So, and that happened through a lot of just very loving people around me who understood how messed up my brain was.
There's more questions. My goodness. So I mentioned it a few times, but how compassionate and empathetic you are as a listener. I remember a few weeks ago I sent you a song, and I was like, this song is making me cry in the middle of a coffee shop, and I thought you were just going to send back a silly face emoji or something, and you were like, what is it specifically about the song that really like touched you? And I wasn't expecting you to say that. I just said like, pretty song, make me feel good. So for those of us who, I would say, compassion or empathy doesn't necessarily come naturally, you are very good at asking those specific questions that goes deeper, goes further, and by your asking, it requires us to go further and go deeper and learn that language for ourselves and actually experience healing. So what resources would you recommend for those of us to practice compassionate language or empathetic language, or even like what questions do you typically ask somebody who is hurting? Because some of us, a question that's not, and how does that make you feel, and how do you feel about that? Something shallow like that, but you ask a specific question, that brings up a good answer that actually allows us to go deeper into ourselves. So what questions can we ask those who are hurting around us that allow us to pursue compassion and suffering with them?
That's a great question. And I love that because it's super applicable to all of us. So for me, one of the biggest things that has been helpful with doing this has been learning how to engage my own story. Engaging my own story has helped make me hopefully better at engaging other people's stories. So I have a statement I'm going to give you at the end of this, and I have one that this is a magic 3 words. I didn't know there were magic words, but these are a magic 3 words that I have found help everybody so much. tell me more. So often when someone tells you something, it's the tip of the iceberg. And so for you to lean in, raise your eyebrows, and say, wow, that sounds important. Can you tell me more? Whew, you just opened up the floodgates. So tell me more is a magic words. That's like the biggest one. The other I would say is actually not words at all, surprisingly enough. This blew my mind. So there's this guy named Adam Young who has an amazing podcast. He's a therapist, used to be a pastor. And one of the things he talks a lot when you engage other people's stories is that most of what our brains, before our brains read what you're telling me, my brain reads what you're saying to me with your body. And so even if your words are wrong, if your body has a posture of listening and attentiveness, that's going to speak volumes. To like actually look at somebody, lean in, raise your eyebrows, show that you're nodding along in things, and just being really present with them. Like if you can, if the posture of your body communicates, I'm open and I want to know more, I'm listening, I'm engaging, I'm into this, that's going to speak volumes. And it's a very active skill, but the cool thing about it is anybody can learn it. Like these are things that we can learn. You don't have to be a professional counselor to be good at engaging other people in their stories. To be able to say to someone, tell me more, to like engage with them with your face and like be zoned in, that'll take you so far. And honestly, 97% of the people I interact with a lot of times don't do that just because it's a thing that we're not really focused on a lot, you know? So that's very helpful. I would say the tell me more is magic words. I would say the body is very important. And there's a statement someone told me recently that haunted me. There's this guy by the name of Dan Allender, been very influential in my life. And he has this interesting saying when it comes to engaging with people, suffering with them, being compassionate. He essentially asks, you have two options. Would you rather be a coward or a fool? You can be a fool and ask something that could be stupid, but show this person that you're still caring for them, or you can chicken out. That statement has haunted me since I heard it. So, embrace foolishness. It's okay. There's grace. But tell me more, and being attuned with people goes a long, long way.
So I had a question about is OCD always trauma induced, or like had you not experienced that trauma early in your life, would you have developed that, or would it have developed later on?
Yeah.
You know, just curious about that.
That's a great question. I don't know, but I have some frameworks. So that's a great question. And that's something I've wondered a lot about for my life. I know with some people, the onset of it is not trauma-induced. So for instance, I was talking to someone recently, and she was 19 years old when she got it, completely came out of left field. No idea where it came from, but that's, changed her life. And she actually got into the field of helping people with it and stuff. There's a good chance that I had a neurodivergent kind of brain anyway, and it might have just been sitting there and sometime it was going to pop up and that kind of triggered it. Could also be a thing where it didn't. I know that from some of the research I've done that really it can happen in childhood, your teenage years, adulthood. A lot of people see it pop up more so late teens into your 20s more often, but there's been cases of it popping up lots of different places in life. My inkling would probably be that if that's just an expression of a brain that's wired differently, probably we're born with differently wired brains, and they just different things in life kind of spark different things to life. But yeah, I don't know 100% for sure, but I do know that it has happened different ways for different people that I've interacted with. Great question.
I have pages. But, first of all, thank you for graciously giving us your time this evening. That's really great. Thank you, Andrew. Second, Chloe sort of took my question, so I'm pretty upset. And third is maybe I can re-ask the question in a better way.
Ooh.
Well, no.
Dance off.
Here we go. Sorry. No, I kid. We don't come with name tags that says, "Hi, I'm Andrew, and I have OCD," or "Here's my brain scan."
Yeah.
So my question was, and maybe this is a church question because, what a bunch of weird guys that Jesus had around him. and very, very diverse. And even in this room of 20 people or so, very diverse people, and it's part of being the community of faith. They get, which is why we're doing this, because why we think this is so important. You know, how does the church engage these things, engage one another? But because we don't come with name tags and say, here's how to treat me, or here's how to communicate with me. That's what I should say. Here's how to communicate with me, or here's how to best walk with me in faith. Can you give us just 2 or 3 practical steps that we can begin sort of putting into practice as we learn to be better stewards of one another's lives inside the body?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first one I would say is that whatever you do, if you're a pastor, a minister, mental health worker, retired, single, married, ditch digger, doctor, whatever you do, the invitation, like I think in particularly in Colossians, it says, put on compassion. If we really realized that being compassionate and caring for other people and being generous with our time and the space in our lives is one of the best gifts that we can bring the world, it changes the way we look at the world. As a pastor, on a good day, I get 5 people before they all leave in the building and go for lunch. And when I'm looking out on them, I know that there's some really hurting people that I don't always get to. And as the church, we all have a responsibility for caring all of them. You know, Jesus was the best of the best of the best. He spent most of his time with 12 guys. That was, you know, like he was God, for goodness sake. And 12 close guys around him. I mean, just imagine one person over here, a couple people over here, a couple people over here. If just like approaching the community around us and the community of faith with this idea of like knowing everyone around here suffers with something that I might not see, and I have a chance to be compassionate and loving towards them, just having that kind of framework when you come to church, you know, kind of lowering your expectations and increasing your expectancy that God might use you to touch somebody that day could really be a game changer. And that's just a little mind move, you know? I think one of the other things to be very, very aware of is to just be aware of the reality that our brains are all so different and our experiences are so different. And when someone comes at you, maybe kind of aggressively or very bluntly or a little shy or different things like that, the million things in your brain, maybe they don't like me, maybe I said the wrong thing. More often than not, that's usually not the case. If they tell you that's the case, check yourself. But, you know, to approach from a place of compassion, how can I love the people around me, and to just have this understanding of you might be struggling with something completely different than me. Like having that reality is so, so important. The final thing I would say, I think about that is become an open, safe space for people to share their stories. The church is a place where I'm very convinced we're all finding out how God is inviting us to be a part of his story, and he's wanting us to bring all of our stories into that. And it's really surprising how few places there are safely to be able to share your stories and your hurts. And so creating spaces within the church, small groups are a great place for that. I know some churches that even intentionally do story groups where people take 6 months and bring stories from their lives to share, is one of the best places to find healing and like be able to actually know the idiosyncrasies of someone's life. Yeah, being aware that people suffer differently, hidden than you, being a part of a church body and just coming with a spot of how can I be compassionate and open space for people today. Being willing to listen to and share people's stories are, I think, wonderful, wonderful practical things. It's changed my life and groups that I've been a part of, so that's what I'd say.
All right, will you guys give him one more hand? Thank you so much again. You can. I know some people are awkward when I pray for them, like up here. So wherever you feel less awkward, that's totally fine. If you feel comfortable, if you would extend a hand or something, that's what we did in the Assemblies of God church growing up. I know this is really nothing weird happens. Fine, I promise. I'm just gonna pray for you, if that's okay. God, I just thank you that you invite us to the table and you invite us to the garden. God, that we can come and our brokenness to pursue a perfect Savior. And he says, look, this is my body that's broken for you, that you understand the pain that we endure, you understand the suffering that we endure because you endured it yourself. I thank you that you take our broken stories and allow it to point towards the grace and mercy that you offer us. Lord, I pray that as we leave this room today, you fill our mind with your thoughts, that you fill our eyes with your tears, that you equip us with the ability to see the brokenness of those around us and with the compassion, especially, to meet them where they are and show them the loving kindness that you would show them. I thank you especially for Pastor Andrew for coming and sharing with us tonight. I just pray a special blessing over him, his family, and his ministry down in Cottage Grove. I pray that you continue to reveal yourself through moments of getting coffee with people and listening to their stories. Lord, I thank you for this series that we're doing, and I pray that people continue to find healing, though not necessarily curing of the things that they deal with, because sometimes these are thorns in the flesh that we have to deal with throughout our lives, but sometimes they help us to understand more and more of you. God, I thank you again for meeting us where we are, and may we experience more compassion as we leave this place today. And it's in Jesus' name we pray, amen. Thanks again. We will be blessed as you go tonight. And next week we'll be hearing from Alan Walker, and we'll be hearing about the Christian response, how we as Christians should approach the subject of mental health. And we will see you all there.